Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Hope you can hear me. Okay. Welcome. Great to see everyone. My name is Cho Lei. I am the chair of Chancellor Society. I'm also a volunteer. I'm excited to be with you today and wanted to welcome all of you to today's Chancellor Society event. This is the fourth virtual event in our series of events this year. And tonight we are exploring equitable voting and representation, and that's our topic. It is the most relevant and timely, given that we are going to be entering into elections very soon. And so I am just excited to be with you. I wanted to say a few words as chair of Chancellor Society. This year being a very special year with COVID-19, all of our events are pretty much on hold, but we are still very happy to still come together virtually in a setting like this as a community and stay connected to UCLA by learning more about the work of our amazing faculty and leadership. And so just to share with you a little bit about the organization of UCLA Chancellor Society that I'm and many other people are a part of, we are approximately 5,000 donor households who support a variety of areas across our campus with annual gifts totaling 1,000 or more. And the fact that you're still a part of this wonderful organization, I wanted to thank you for joining me and being affiliated with Chancellor Society. Your support and the private support of others through Chancellor Society donors is essential to maintaining the world-class education of UCLA. And for us to be known as really a top institution, the #1 public institution in the country, 4 straight years in a row, it's just amazing. And our reputation as a top institution in academia, in philanthropy, in research, the health sciences, and the list just goes on, and it's something that we're truly a part of. And if you haven't already heard, I mean, just a few days ago, we have a brand new Nobel laureate that is a UCLA on faculty, Andrea Getz, and it's just amazing to see a woman Nobel laureate be recognized for her work in physics, and that's just something to be real proud of. So this is just simply to say thank you. We appreciate your membership. We appreciate your contribution and your support of UCLA. So as we begin today's presentation, I wanted to remind everyone we are utilizing the Zoom technology, and we will have your audio muted and video turned off throughout the duration of the event. This event is being recorded and will be made available after the event. And after the event, there'll also be a brief survey. Your feedback is super important to us to bring you some of the best programming that UCLA has to offer. So with that being said, I am grateful to be introducing your moderator tonight, who will lead a discussion with faculty from 4 of UCLA's Ethnic Studies Research Centers on the topic of voting and representation. Before I introduce you to our moderator, I wanted to acknowledge that we're keeping close track of the time, because I recognize that 6 p.m., many people are planning to watch the vice presidential debate. So we want to be on track as much as possible. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Melody De La Cruz Viesca. She's the Associate Director at UCLA's Asian American Studies Center, who holds the roles as a Managing Editor of AAPI Nexus and as a Director of the AAPI Community Development Census Information Center. I read a little bit about Melanie, and I understand that she's got the domain expertise on census data and demographics, and can really speak to the impact of multiple dimensions of our economy and public policy. So Melanie, welcome, and I'll let you take it from here.
Oh, wow. Thank you for those kind words and that kind introduction. Good evening, everybody. Again, I'm Melanie De La Cruz Viesca with the Asian American Studies Center, one of the 4 ethnic studies centers established in 1969 under the Institute for American Cultures. For over 5 decades, the centers have advanced historical, transformative, and interdisciplinary research, publications, archival collections, civic engagement, alumni, and community relations at UCLA and beyond. We have more than 250 faculty affiliated with our centers across campus, including the College of Social Sciences, the Luskin School of Public Affairs, Law School, the School of Public Health, and much more. I am thankful to the UCLA Chancellor Society for the opportunity to serve as tonight's moderator, and I'm honored to introduce our panel of dynamic speakers affiliated with our centers, who have been deeply involved with voting rights research, advocacy, and policymaking. First, I'd like to introduce Matt Barreto, who is Professor of Political Science and Chicano Studies and Central American Studies. His research examines the political participation of racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. He teaches various courses on racial and ethnic politics, Latino politics, Voting Rights Act, elections, statistics, and American politics. Since 2007, Barreto has been a co-principal with Dean Gary Segura of the Luskin School of Public Affairs of Latino Decisions, a political polling firm surveying and analyzing the Latino vote. Shannon Speed is a tribal citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. She's the director of the American Indian Studies Center and professor of gender studies and anthropology at UCLA. Dr. Speed has worked for the last 2 decades in Mexico and in the United States on issues of indigenous autonomy, sovereignty, gender, neoliberalism, violence, migration, social justice, and activist research. She's published 6 books and edited volumes, including her most recent, Incarcerated Stories, Indigenous Women, Migrants, and Violence in the Settler Capitalist State. Isaac Bryan is the Public Policy Director for the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies. He's a policy shaper, published scholar whose work has helped to advance activist-led movements and policy change around issues of racial, economic, and social justice. Isaac is also the founding director of the UCLA Black Policy Project and head of the Public Policy Division for the $1 Million Hoods Project. And finally, Professor Natalie Masaoka of the Political Science and Asian American Studies. Her research interests include racial and ethnic politics, immigration, political behavior, and public opinion. Her first book, The Politics of Belonging, Race, Public Opinion, and Immigration, co-authored with Jane Jun, examines how and why whites, Blacks, and Asian Americans, Latinos view immigration and immigrants in systemically different ways. Her second book, Multiracial Identity and Racial Politics in the United States, explores the rise of Americans who self-identify as mixed race or multiracial and the impact on politics. So let's get this discussion started. The first question is for all the panelists. And the question is, what do you see as the most significant and troubling barrier to your community's participation in voting? In particular, because the election landscape is so much more different in 2020 compared with 2016. So Shannon, you want to start us off? Oh, Shannon, you're on mute.
I keep doing that. My apologies. Chokma, everyone. Greetings. Thank you for the question, Melanie. I want to just start by quickly saying that I acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva people as the first peoples of the unceded lands of Tovanga or Los Angeles, on which UCLA is located. So as you can imagine, for Native Americans, the barriers to voting are myriad. Just to mention a few, for many in Indian country, rural residents makes accessing polling places difficult. And meanwhile, poor or no mail service makes mail-in ballots a barrier where it actually facilitates participation. For some other groups, for Native Americans, it does not necessarily. High levels of poverty. I mean, when people have to choose between putting dinner on the table for their family or putting gas in their car to drive 60 or 70 miles to a polling place. COVID, I think this year, of course, has to be mentioned. People are staying at home and people, I think there's a general fatigue brought about by the pandemic and what surrounds it. But the most significant barrier, I'd say, the overarching barrier, is a sense of disconnection from the national culture of politics and a sense of distrust of the system that was, a system that was largely forced upon them historically. Native Americans were not granted citizenship or the right to vote until 1924. In several states, they were blocked well into the middle of the 20th century from voting. And despite being 6.7 million people in this country, Native Americans are virtually never the target of outreach from campaigns. So Native people, both rural and urban, feel a great sense of alienation from the US political system and elections in particular.
Natalie, do you want to go next?
Thanks everyone for having me here today. It's I think an important opportunity to talk about Asian Pacific Islander voting. I think when we think about the community, it's highly diverse. If we first think about Asian America, this is a population that is one of the most highly immigrant populations out of our major racial and ethnic groups, where if you look at the adults of 18 or older, it's over 70% born in another country. And of course, what that comes with is that there are challenges related to their immigrant status. And so things that we're concerned about, particularly as we think about November, are of one, immigrants knowing their rights, but then also the process of registration, right, and then understanding various different policies and identification of what's in their best interests. We also have various concerns related to the different languages that are spoken and making sure that language access is accurate, right, and widespread, so that immigrants know that there are resources there to help them, inform them about the vote. And then, of course, when we think about Pacific Islanders, this is another very diverse community where we have also concerns similar to what Shannon has shared with Native American communities, where we're concerned about the extremely high impact of COVID, but also various different issues related to challenges related to socioeconomic status and the various different challenges that Pacific Islanders are facing today, particularly under COVID.
Isaac, what do you see as the most significant barrier facing your community?
A lot. I think the first is a fear or a concern that our participation in voting, like many others, is not valued and does not result in a change in the material conditions of our lives. Right. This year we saw, like we've seen many years before, kind of the movement for Black lives and a reaffirming that Black lives should matter. But then at the same time, that movement that called for us to reimagine our systems of accountability in law enforcement institutions is not backed by either major ticket, right? It's not something we're going to hear on the debate stage tonight, and we certainly didn't hear it last week, 2 weeks ago. Another concern that I have is that we are a disproportionate share of our unhoused population in Los Angeles and across the country. And so during a global pandemic where mail-in ballots and polling places are changing and evolving, and those kind of barriers to participation, I think, are going to be exacerbated for the Black community. And so those are kind of the general concerns that I think are going to serve as barriers to our participation. That being said, Black women are still the most reliable voting bloc of any demographic in the country. If Black men need to catch up, but Black people as a whole have always fought for civic engagement and participation. And that's been on my mind pretty heavy, as yesterday was Fannie Lou Hamer's birthday. And so I'm optimistic, even though the barriers still remain.
Matt.
Thank you, Melanie, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Like many of you, I'm also looking very much forward to the vice presidential debate, in which we'll get to hear from a woman of color for the first time in that role, and speaking to many of these issues, I think, that we are all interested in. In the Latino community, I think some of the things that are most worrisome are ensuring that as voting changes are taking place, we're rapidly changing how people are voting this year, that we keep an eye towards language access, that information is available and carried out in terms of how to vote by mail, how to vote early, what the rules are, that is equitable, and that is available in Spanish in communities. The Latino community is the youngest and has the most first-time voters, both young people and naturalized citizens. And we don't always have decades of experience with the political system here. And so doing that extra outreach is important. When it comes to vote by mail, lots of studies have demonstrated that it is our communities, all of us here collectively, who have higher disproportionate rejection rates when it comes to signature requirements. Many of us don't have traditional last names like John or Jane Smith. And so when you have names that are either hyphenated, when you go by a middle name or other things, oftentimes your signature doesn't match. That information is not known. In Florida, just during the primary election this summer, 35,000 accurately cast ballots were rejected for signature mismatch issues. 35,000. And we're expecting over 70,000 ballots could be rejected that are otherwise accurately counted. And many of those are in the Black and Latino community. So there are a lot of issues at stake in terms of how we vote and making sure that there is equitable access. Isaac mentioned closing polling places, changing polling places. Many of these things are even being done for innocent reasons to keep up with the health requirements of COVID. So some of our traditional polling places are being closed by people who are meaning to do well to give us safer and healthier voting locations. But that means a lot of changes, and those changes need to be communicated and spread out to all voters so that everyone is properly informed on how they can vote, where they can vote, and when they can vote in this election.
Some really great points that everybody raised. I think one that's really of deep concern to communities of colors is voter suppression. So I guess, you know, maybe Isaac, you started to touch on that a little bit, and then I'll go to Matt on offering some insights on how do we fight voter suppression efforts?
Yeah, we fight voter suppression efforts by reducing the ways that voter suppression can take place, right? We know the various ways that we've gone around the Voting Rights Act, right? Especially in the South, when we require different kinds of identification, we're forcing folks to re-register in new ways. And we are, you know, looking for people who are voting additional times as opposed to voter intimidation tactics at polling places, right? We have our focus on the wrong thing. And so the way that we stop voter suppression, in my mind, or at least mitigated in this election, is to make sure that everyone has free access to a fair and clean election, the way that they are constitutionally entitled to, and that we continue to pressure Congress and the Supreme Court to uphold the standards that allow folks to participate in a way that's accessible and easy. And we also have to think critically about the barriers to voting participation, in that folks from various communities, and particularly the Black community and others, work on election days and don't have those days off, right? And the hours in which our polling places historically had been open, but even in this mail-in time, do not always favor or are advantageous to every single community. And so we have to be mindful of those who are working third shifts, and single mothers and heads of household who are balancing multiple jobs. It's a type of voter suppression that is baked in the way that our economic systems work with our civic institutions. And we have to be mindful of all of these and how they intersect to keep folks from really getting to the polls.
Let me just add to that. I think what Isaac has just reminded us of is a lot of it is systemic and is baked into decades, if not centuries, of inequality. But there is also, unfortunately, legal and policy restrictions that are being implemented this year that are directly related to voter suppression. And I'll just name a few that we should be working to reduce and looking out for. We have a research center at the Latino Policy Institute called the Voting Rights Project, and we're actively working on some of these issues. The first, as you mentioned, is voter intimidation. We're involved in the lawsuit in Pennsylvania to block campaign efforts to bus in out of state and out of county supposed poll watchers, which are really just there to intimidate voters. That's happening in many places. There is not a problem, and there's not a need for out of town poll watchers, yet these are being called for, and we're actively involved in that. Closing down early voting. Many states are now using multiple excuses, but they're reducing early voting days. And we know that in particular, communities of color have often relied upon that. In Georgia, they're requiring everyone to purchase their own stamp, and they won't tell you exactly how many stamps you need. We know that all ballots are different. In some jurisdictions, they're longer, and you have to then go to the post office in person, get your ballot weighed by that stamp yourself. Luckily, here in California, our absentee ballots are pre-stamped, and the postage is paid by our government. But that's not the case in the state of Georgia. They're requiring folks to go out. We've seen people closing down vote by mail drop locations. Just in Texas, it was announced on Thursday of last week. And on Friday of last week, our research center filed a lawsuit challenging that decision to close down absentee mail drop locations. In Harris County, where Houston is, some voters have to drive 47 miles. Shannon referred to this as well. It's an extreme problem in rural and Native American communities, but in urban counties like Harris County, which has over 2 million voters, they now have one single absentee mail drop location. And if you've seen the news, there are pictures of these cars stacked in lines in downtown Houston trying to go and drop off their ballot. And finally, some states have added this year, as they have expanded vote by mail, they have added witness or notary public requirements. So imagine this, you request your vote by mail ballot because you want to stay safe, but you have to go out and find a notary public and get your ballot notarized, show an ID, and now you have to let the notary scrutinize whether or not you're the right voter. So this is happening today in 2020. And we have to make sure that everyone has a right to vote and fight against that because we know that these affect communities of color disproportionately. And it's something that we have to address.
Shannon or Natalie, did you want to weigh in on this question?
I mean, I think, to also dovetail on some of Matt's points, I mean, this is really one of, while of course we want to combat it while it's happening, this is one of the value added of what we're doing with research, right? Which is that we're training our students to make sure that we can collect the data, monitor discrimination, right? Making sure that they can then have the skills for example, GIS, mapping technologies, basic spreadsheet design, various different types of statistical methods for us to be able to make sure that in fact communities of color really are not being discriminated. And if they are, we have the data, right, and the evidence to turn around, right, and call attention to what is going on in communities of color.
I think my colleagues have stated the issues very well.
Okay, well, Shannon, let me ask you, what are the issues at stake for Native Americans and Native women in particular in this election?
Well, thank you for that question. There are some major issues at stake. Always for Native American communities, of course, federal funding, which is, always less than it should be, and is particular low right now, and also federal funding both for rural communities in Indian country, but also for urban Indian population programs. Sovereignty is another major issue, and self-determination for Native peoples. And here, I think this year's presidential election is particularly crucial because the current administration has been notably hostile to Native sovereignty issues. Also, under this administration, the opening of public lands, which are by definition lands taken from Native peoples and held by the government to resource extraction and exploitation. That's a major concern for Native Americans under this administration. So change of administration is a crucial issue for many Native peoples. Clearly, I think it's important to signal that we have a lot more Native women on the ballot this year than we've ever had, and getting them into office matters for Native people. We call it rematriating leadership. Just as an example, one issue of particular importance in Indian country is violence against Native women, who suffer rates of violence up to 10 times higher than the rest of the population. And among Native women, 4 of 5 women will suffer violence in their lifetimes. There are thousands and thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women about whom authorities have had very little interest. Until recently, in the last election, 2 Native women were elected to Congress. And since that time, more attention is being given because they are raising, sounding alarm bells in Washington about what's happening with the missing and murdered women and with violence against Native women more generally. So we have several Native candidates women candidates running for election this year. And I think having more representation will inevitably be better for women in this regard.
Thank you. Kind of continuing along that question for the rest of the panelists, aside from the presidential election, what are some crucial voting measures that are greatly impacting your community's well-being? Does anybody want to start? I'll pick on Natalie, and then we'll go to Isaac, then Matt.
Get the spotlight on me. I think for sure what we've done with the Asian American Centers recently, we hosted a panel on Proposition 16, which is seeking to rescind Prop 209 here in California, which outlawed the use of affirmative action in governmental hiring and university admissions. This is an issue that we found has Asian Americans on both sides of the proposition, that there is vehement opposition, but there's also a good share of support within the Asian American community. What we're trying to do is offer information about to what extent Asian Americans really are, in fact, particularly with the attention towards university admissions, to what extent that they are in fact discriminated against due to affirmative action or race conscious policies. And I think our panel, was a great opportunity for us to discuss how race conscious policies really do in many ways assist Asian Americans. And then in fact, what we found after 209 is that Asian American admissions went down, right? And so this is some of the data that oftentimes gets missed in mainstream media attempts to try to place Asian Americans, right, as this kind of model minority group that is getting discriminated against, by the so-called admissions of Latinos and African Americans, and displacing Asian Americans. And so I think this is one of the things that we like to provide for the center is really demystifying and correcting some of the information that's out there.
Thanks, Isaac.
Yeah, our center has played an incredible role in the conversation about mass incarceration for some time. Our director, Dr. Kelly Lato Hernandez, MacArthur Genius Fellow, my mentor, wrote the book on the rise of human caging here on the West Coast, all the way back to 1860. And based off of that work, we launched our $1 Million Hoods Project, which maps the human and fiscal costs of incarceration. And we've been doing that for 6 years, thinking critically about our investments in systems of harm relative to our investments in systems of care and opportunity. And that's become very relevant this election season, because we have Prop 25, for example, on the ballot, which is a proposition that looks at the conversation between the money bail industry and what's set to replace it, which is a risk assessment instrument. And there's been a split in the criminal justice community about which way to go. And interestingly enough, the LA Times endorsed Measure 25 this past week and cited $1 Million Hoods, cited our report on the cost of freedom on the money bail industry in their decision to side with it. Interestingly enough, on a personal level, I do not support Proposition 25 because of concerns about risk assessment tools and the scholarship that's leading around that shows that the kind of biases that are baked in there might make it even harder for folks to maintain their innocence pre-trial. But that's just one example of the ways that we're trying to stay involved and actively staying involved. Another thing that we're heavily involved in is the Measure J campaign here in Los Angeles that is looking to change the county constitution to earmark a certain percentage of the county's unrestricted revenues to go towards alternatives to incarceration and different types of community investment. And so we just released a report last week looking at how much the county of Los Angeles spent incarcerating just Black folks last year, right? And that sum for just 6 charges was over $150 million, right? And so there are ways that we can do things differently. And it's important for us at the Bunch Center and at the Black Policy Project to leverage our position here at the university to do the rigorous research that bridges that gap in understanding so that voters can make the decisions that are rooted in science and rooted in data, and decision makers are equipped with the best data as they continue to legislate and try to solve the most difficult issues of our time. And so similar to the Asian American Studies Center and others, we also plan on hosting webinars, panels, and conversations about these various propositions and ballot measures. Our current acting director, as Kelly's on sabbatical, is Dr. Lori Fraser-Yoakley, who is an all-star when it comes to gauging voter attitudes and figuring out how to message in a way that inspires folks to go out to the polls and voice their civic engagement. So we've got a couple things still lined up for this month before November 3rd, but we know ballots are already in the mail, and there's an urgency, and we feel it here at the Bunch Center to play a role in uplifting the importance of this election and the research needed for folks to make the right decisions.
That's great. I love hearing about the projects that our colleagues are working on. So it's fun to be a part of this discussion to also, update and hear all the great things that Shannon and Isaac and Natalie are working on. I think in the Latino community and the immigrant community, there's no doubt that at the top of our issue agenda right now is getting the COVID pandemic under control. Like other communities of color, Latinos have been very hard hit by this. Latinos only represent 8.4% of the population over 65, but we represent 21% of all deaths. It's the highest disparity of any group. And that is certainly having not only health, but also economic impacts. And so there has to be a race-conscious, centered way to deal with this health pandemic. And that's certainly top of the list. But I would be remiss if I did not mention the news of today, which is that as the White House was unpacking their so-called zero tolerance policy, there were discussions about actively taking measures to intercept children at the border. You've probably seen a lot of news about this, and this has had deep impacts in the Latino community, not just on those thousands of people impacted. And we've seen reports of over 10 to over a dozen children who have died as a result of custody, but that this was a conscious policy, that they thought that this would somehow discourage migration and refugee and asylum seeking if there was a government sponsored policy. And so this is certainly at the top of the Latino agenda as well. Many people are well connected in the immigrant community to folks who have been impacted by what happened in the last few years and what has been happening for a long time in terms of immigrant detention and harassment. And so that is something I think that has gotten attention, and with today's news continues to be a top issue. And we look forward to a humane solution to the immigration issues in our country and a humane policy towards the treatment of those coming to this country who are seeking asylum and refugee status and not intercepting them at the border and separating them from their children. So we're working on those issues, doing research and studying those, and we hope to bring about better policies as a result.
Wow, so much incredible work, research and insights, and I can't believe we're already nearing the end of our discussion. So I feel like we've only really scratched the surface. And so I wanted to ask all the speakers to offer final thoughts. I think especially as we're getting our communities to turn out to vote, what are the key, messages and like points that we need to be raising with everybody to turn out to vote? So I'll start off with Shannon, then we'll go to Natalie, Isaac, and then end with Matt.
Wow, thank you all. This has been really wonderful listening to all of this fantastic research. I think all of these issues that my colleagues have mentioned overlap greatly with the issues of the Native community. And one thing I just want to mention quickly is that all of the issues that are affecting Latinos at the border, people crossing at the border, a significant portion of that population are Indigenous people coming from Latin America. So there's really a very strong overlap. And my recent research is on that. That's why I wanted to raise it. I think just as a closing message, what I want to say, because I talked a lot about the barriers, but I think it's really important that, we had 18 Native women run, at least initially run for office. Some did not win their primaries, but we have a lot more Native women running, a lot more Native people running than we've ever had before. And I think social media has been tremendously important in mobilizing youth to come out and be involved in political issues, engaged with political issues, and paying attention to what's happening in Washington. So there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful. Native peoples actually hold the potential to be influential in several swing states, including Arizona, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, Wisconsin, Colorado. So, you know, I'm very hopeful that Native peoples will see the opportunity to, you know, make their voice heard, make their opinions known through the voting process, and that we'll have a banner year for voter turnout and for the election of Native people in this election. Thank you for having me.
Thank you,
Yes.
Natalie.
Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to participate in this panel. It's really been a wonderful opportunity to learn about the various different things that are happening in our sister centers. I think I would also like to end, like Shannon, thinking about really the power and influence that our communities have today, particularly as we think about elections. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial minority group in the United States, which means that should also be the fastest growing voting electorate in the United States. So to encourage our communities to turn out to vote and to recognize the power, right, of the growing electorate that we know it is about to be.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, this election is critical, and we say that every single election, but this is especially critical. We have a lot of damage that's been done with race neutral policy, and sometimes not race neutral, very direct policy that has to be intentionally thought about and rolled back and redesigned. There are so many appointments still to be had, and we also have to look all the way down the ballot. Here in LA, we have a board of supervisors race. That's essentially a 12-year appointment. Nobody's ever challenged when they go in. We have a district attorney's race that's been called the second most important race in the country outside of the presidential election, right? We have a number of propositions and ballot measures, Measure J here in the county, but all of the propositions statewide, Schools and Communities First, others that could change the material conditions of many of our lives. And there are some very harmful things on the ballot as well, right? The criminalization of people is on the ballot. Justice is on the ballot. Economic opportunity is on the ballot. What our recovery after this global pandemic looks like is on the ballot. And so we have to turn people out, and we have to inspire folks to move and to vote. And we have to capture that as researchers and scholars, just what this moment has meant and what progress is made as a result of the kinds of choices that we've made, so people feel that sense of civic engagement again when we measure outcomes that have been empirically verified to have improved the conditions of our life, because people don't feel the efficacy of their vote, but they should, because it matters, and this election critically matters. And so I'm so grateful to have shared space with all of you today, and I'm looking forward to this election.
Thank you. And Matt, close it out.
Thanks, Melanie, for directing us and leading us this evening. It was a great conversation. I think there's so much that our nation is struggling with. The Black Lives Matter movement that we have seen so strong this spring and summer and into the fall, I think is an important reminder to everyone of what is at stake. Racial justice is on the ballot, whether and regardless of which community you are from. So many communities are feeling the brunt of the policies today. And I would remind people to involve themselves on those matters specifically. Here in California, it is very straightforward. Everyone is getting a mail ballot sent to them. You probably got that earlier this week. And so, study your voter guide. I think Isaac mentioned so many important ballot initiatives. Those are probably the most critical things facing us here in California. But after you do that, there are so many opportunities to do phone banking and to reach our brothers and sisters in Arizona and Florida and Pennsylvania and Michigan and these other battleground states that may decide. So if you care deeply about that presidential election, I would just encourage everyone to take 30 minutes out of their day and get involved in one of these phone banking opportunities, of which there are many, and try to make a difference, not only here in California, but across this country.
Well, thank you very much to all the panelists for taking the time to speak and offer insightful perspectives and strategies for the upcoming elections and beyond. We hope that tonight's event was informative and gives you both some ideas and encouragement to guide us through these uncertain and challenging times. Now, I would like to introduce Nnamdi Okafor, who's the Regional Director of Development for the Central U.S., who will close today's program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melanie. I'm just excited about this conversation. It was amazing. I know I'm walking away feeling deeply informed. So thank you so much. As mentioned before, I am the Regional Director for the Central United States. And if you have any questions about the Chancellor Society or giving to UCLA, please feel free to reach out to me directly. It would be an honor to be of help and to support you in that. I also want to take an opportunity to thank our Chancellor Society Chair, Cho Lo, who gave her opening remarks and participating in tonight's event. In addition, I want to also, of course, thank our amazing and wonderful panelists who shared their extremely insightful and compelling narratives. So please thank you, Matt Barreto, Shannon Speed, Isaac Bryan, Natalie Masuuka, and our amazing moderator, Melanie De La Cruz Viesca. Also, I would like to take an opportunity to really thank the Institute for American Cultures, which consists of our 4 ethnic studies research centers, who helped us to put together this important panel discussion this evening. And last, but certainly not least, I would love to thank all of our generous supporters of UCLA, and especially our Chancellor Society members who are in attendance this evening. We are excited to continue to create these compelling and interesting conversations for you to participate in. I know a lot of us are getting geared up to go and listen to the Vice President debates, and we want to just say thank you so much. And again, until we talk again, go Bruins. Have a good evening. Thank you so much.